morning to you on this wonderful Tuesday of December. And we are live at Fifth Factor. If you've joined us, you're on the Fifth Connection. And on the other side this morning, I have Theo. Theo, you're alive from the dead. No, came back from a very busy
you did say,
schedule.
Yeah, but you did say in many earlier episodes, there's the cycle, there's life and there's death, and there's life and death. And so I am used to transitioning then between all of those. So yes, busy schedule, absolutely. It's the end of an academic year in the north, end of the semester. I know South African schools have closed already. We're still actively busy. But you've done an exceptional job, Terence Martin, in holding the fort there. So well done, sir. Absolutely.
Well, should I say the fort has been holding me, so I'm very glad the fort is there.
Good.
Well, it's great having you join us again.
Thank you.
And we're going to continue right along. This will be the last down payment. Well, a preacher must never say, and lastly, because then he just lost.
There's always,
so,
there's always something. And don't say these are my final words, because somebody may wait for you in the parking lot.
That's right. But it's number 7 in the series on thinking well. That is the title of the series, Thinking Well. We went all the way from jump-starting our thinking, to tuning up our thinking, to pulling away. And then we looked somewhat at how does truth come at us? And what does it mean to be a follower of the way and to be thinking in a way that is honoring to God and the world of God, as well as the Word of God. All these things work in sync. And to train our minds to be thinking sharp. Some of us are reaching for the bench because we've just stopped thinking. And your brain will atrophy. I'm not talking about, we lose our memory as we, of course, get older. We can't remember names and streets. But there can be a sharpness to our life that stays alive. But we need to be in there, actively engaging with the world of God as well as the Word of God. And so we're going to look at a couple of Proverbs, a clump of Proverbs in Proverbs chapter 24. It goes from verse 30 to 34. A group of Proverbs that really hangs together. And we're going to talk about how do you ramp up your thinking. When something gets ramped up, of course, it's taken up a number of revolutions. Engines are roaring and things are getting ready to take off. Well, think about a military context with me this morning, where soldiers are called to attention. It's a parade and they're all standing in line and they are at attention. And of course, the person in front says, attention. So they stand in a specific posture. They click their heels, their feet are together, their hands are at their sides, and their bodies are straight. And their position signifies that they are attentive to any commands or instructions that will come from their superiors. The aspects of attention, of course, in the military would include things like discipline, awareness, situational awareness, and uniformity. But the emphasis is on alertness and readiness. Well, this clump of Proverbs has got at the heart of it this idea of being alert and ready to think, ready to act, and to interact particularly with God's world. You see, the book of Proverbs has 915 verses, and those verses are clumped into 7 sections, 7 collections. The collections in turn are divided into three movements, and the movements are very, very specific. The movement is from naive to wise to wiser still. The dad is coaching his boy. The sage is coaching the young man, the young adult. And in all likelihood, the young man, the young boy, is imbibing the father's wisdom. And so the Proverbs are really one-liners, sometimes clumps of them, sometimes whole sections of them. They rise out of stories, because that's what a proverb is. A proverb is a line that is memorable. It's a generalized statement, and it rises out of the context of a story. And proverbs speak louder than words. I think you've heard that said. And so the adult is telling the understudy that in order to navigate the world, in order to navigate specifically the world of work, that will require that we recruit all of our senses in order to live well in it, to live well inside of this world, because you see, a heritage can be lost through negligence. When we become lackadaisical, right? When we become hard of hearing, when we start to retreat, a whole heritage can go down the tube. And so to navigate the world of work requires that we recruit all of our senses in order to live well in it. Because you see, the book of Proverbs is so wonderfully put together because there are at least 7 portals to the heart, or to anyone's heart. And to the young man's heart, there are 7 portals. What are those portals? The 7 senses. In the West, we normally talk about 5 senses. But in the ancient Near East, a very strong biblical case can be made for 7 senses. Sense of touch, sense of smell, sense of taste, sense of hearing, sense of speech, speaking, sense of listening. They are all portals to the control room, which is the heart. And so the question at the heart of these 5 verses is, what do I need in order to navigate my world effectively and to change appropriately to face it? What do I need to navigate the world effectively and change appropriately in order to face it? Well, there are 2 or 3 principles that can be lifted out of this clump of Proverbs. And the first thing I'd like you to note is in verse number 30 to verse number 31. Let's read those verses first and see how that we need to look at what we see. We need to look at what we see. Listen what the writer, the observer, says in verse number 30. I passed by the field of a sluggard, by the vineyard of a man lacking sense. And behold, it was all overgrown with thorns. The ground was covered with nettles, and its stone walls was broken. So here the observer walks by a field. He passes by a field, but his brain is not in a parking meter. He engages with what he sees. He looks at what he sees. He becomes strategically intentional about what he's looking at. He passes by a field of a sluggard. Now, the sluggard in the text is described as one who is void of heart, one who is lacking heart. Sar leiv is the word, lacking heart. And it could be very well translated as one who's senseless, I pass by the field of a senseless one, because a sluggard is one who lacks sense. By the time you get to verse 34 of this section, you will discover that he's the one who is senseless. Versus one who takes things to heart in verse 32. The man who considers what he sees and is strategically intentional about what he sees. The text says he's one who takes things to heart. A sheet Levi or sheet Libi. He takes things to heart. One is lacking heart, the other one takes things to heart. The Hebrew language here is very, very graphic. And the comparison is between one who's senseless, one who lacks sense, who turns out to be a sluggard, and the one who takes things to heart, the one who is sensible. Senseless versus sensible. So as the observer passes by this field, he continues to describe the field as a vineyard, by the vineyard of a man lacking sense. There we go. By the vineyard of a man lacking sense. It's a field, but now it's defined as a vineyard. And then verse 31, and behold. That word behold is so significant. It means this is a wake-up call. It's what we will call a dramatic conjunctive. It's like a wake-up call. And behold, it was all overgrown with thorns. Now watch how observant this passerby is. This field happens to be a vineyard of a sluggard, because the sluggard is one who lacks sense. Because watch what has happened to the field of this vineyard. It was all overgrown with thorns. Overgrown. And the ground was covered with nettles. It's not just ground cover here. If you are one who's got green fingers and whatever you put into the ground grows, you know what ground cover is. This is ground cover of a different kind. It's the weeds that have taken over. The ground was covered with nettles, and its stone wall was broken down. These are all signs that something has gone into disrepair. A vineyard, a field that has become overgrown with thorns and nettles. And the enclosure is ruined. The stone wall is ruined. Watch how observant the passerby is. Because you see, it will take you to become strategically intentional about your own life. As you look at thinking well, you need to train your mind. What am I looking at? What am I attending to? This word for senseless is really what we would say our 20th century, 21st century equivalent would be brainless. Theo, you were the one who asked the other day about how do you train your senses?
Yep.
Well, the Proverbs of Solomon is the major collector here, right? There are other collections from other people, but one of the ways in which you train your senses is you ask questions. But the flip side of that coin is not only ask questions, but attend to the questioner, the one who's asking the questions. That's how you get to train your mind. Because this word behold is a wake-up call to become attentive, to be attentive. Because as Ian McGilchrist says, attention changes the world. Because attention has to do with making a moral decision, because you have to rearrange your values. When you pay attention to something, all of a sudden that thing that you are attending to rises in terms of its priority in your life and in your world. And your hierarchy of values need to be rearranged. And something that needed to be rearranged here in verse 30 to 31 was things like industry, labor, investment, time. Well, the sluggard is not given to that. The one who lacks heart, the one who's senseless, doesn't spend time on thinking that one through. The investment that needs to be made or has been made, the labor involved, the time involved, what industry would require in order to make this piece of real estate a success. And so, as we look at what we see, as you look at what you see, you need to become an intentional observer, not just a passive observer, but one who's interacting with his world dynamically and has questions at the forefront or in the forefront of his or her mind. It's amazing when we look at something and that thing is vague, right? And we don't start to question what we are looking at. It's like someone who looks at the moon. Now watch this. We tell kids, when you look at the moon, what do you see? I don't know. I'm just looking at something that's glowing in the sky. The parent says to the child, well, isn't there a man in the moon? Well, that's a cultural way of looking at the thing. There's a man in the moon. Because when the Samoans look at the moon, Theo, believe it or not, they see a woman who is weaving. Add to that the Chinese, when they look at the moon, they see a monkey pounding rice. On the other hand, the East Indians see a rabbit. Now, who's right and who's wrong? Because you see, we bring our perceptions to what we look at. And the way we start to become clear about what we're looking at is bombarding what we are looking at with questions. What's happening here? What has happened here? And that's what the observer is drawing our attention to. Look at what you see. And so he's going to unfold this quite deeply as we go through the next couple of verses. And so I'm going to stop right there, Theo. I'm going to pause.
Right.
And I'm going to throw the challenge that when we look at something, when we become attentive to something, that we become aware that our hierarchy of values will shift. It will change because all of a sudden we are going to be putting some value to what we're looking at. That's why our attention is focused on that thing. So, what values have you rearranged in your life recently because of something that you had to attend to? So let me just leave that question there, Theo. Back to you.
Yeah, so this is so crucial. Thanks for highlighting the fact that this is in the world of work, and of course, for me particularly, I was very fascinated by this because you're talking about agriculture, and this is sort of right about LA, and not just right about LA, in one of the trenches, in one of the farms, in one of the communities where we do our work.
Yep.
And so this is fascinating that in agriculture, where you cannot afford to have this kind of laziness, but you can certainly look around and begin to make and draw some conclusions. And it's absolutely true. We should spend some extensive time on this, Terry, because I just want to, before we go here, begin to think about, our country. One of the, let me say, put it this way, one of the things that I have seen, particularly working in these rural communities, and some things have really broken my heart. I've seen squalor. I've seen dogs being mistreated in some of these communities, rural communities particularly. You talk about fields that are, not you don't talk about it, the scripture talks about it, a field of the sluggard, completely overgrown, thistles, nettles, broken walls. I mean, it is. There's a great deal of beauty in South Africa, but there's a great deal that's broken, and it doesn't take long to see that. And so this is a real challenge, and I appreciate that this morning, because I think that we often miss the real touch of the scriptures when we look at our world. We 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 immediately try and talk about people's lives that are arid and dry and void of and filled with thistles. And I suppose you can at some point go there. But do you think, Terry, that sometimes we miss the reality that God highlights and identifies in the scriptures? We sometimes miss that. We overlook it.
We're so out of touch there.
Mm,
We get out of touch. We are city bumpkins. We live in the city.
mm,
And we are so biased when we get into a rural area, for example,
mm,
where there's high poverty. Now, I know in our context here in the Cape, we don't need to go very far to see that.
sure.
We have informal settlements.
I would almost say that the cities generally have this difficulty too. I
We
mean,
do. We
yeah.
do. But we so insulate ourselves, we don't see that. We don't
Mm,
see the, the rabid dog that
mm,
runs across the road. There's been a lack of food, and that dog, you can see, has been mistreated. And you see the
mm,
people scurrying across the road, and we get so out of touch with that.
mm,
And then the scriptures, it takes the scriptures to remind us, because it was written, I mean, a lot of these texts were written in pastoral societies, right?
mm.
What we would call agricultural societies,
Yeah,
right? Where there's agronomy, there are farms,
yeah,
and we can grow out of touch with these realities. And we don't see what we ought to see.
sure. No, good. Well, thank you very much, Terry, for that. And we will continue with this, of course, on trying to understand our need as we navigate the world of work, our industries, and to do it effectively. And what do we need to change appropriately in order to face some of these dilemmas? That it's not just somebody else's problem, it's not just out there, it's right here in our midst, under our noses, in front of us to see what do I need to do? Not what does the government need to do, not what do the politicians have to do. What is it that I need to do? So thanks for that challenge. And that, I have to say, is a challenge for every single person that is being faced with this truth. It's not just restricted to certain geographical areas. So thanks, my brother, for that. And for those of you who've listened in to us this morning, thank you very, very much for joining us here on the Fifth Connection. We'll see you back tomorrow morning. And Terry, as always, thank you so very, very much for breaking this down for us this morning, brother.
Thanks, Theo, and thank you, listeners.
See you in the morning.